We'd like to know the name of your book and, in general, what the book was about and what you were trying to achieve with that book, please.
The book's called The End of Politicians, Time for a Real Democracy. It's about democracy and how it's been, how the definition of democracy has transformed through time, and how it gets its legitimacy has changed, and goes all the way back to Aristotle and the ancient Greek democracy, where they use this random selection to populate most of the political positions, and then talks about modern experiments that are, this idea has been reincarnated, and they're using this all over the world, in Australia in policy juries, in Ireland in citizens' assemblies. And it says that, look, if randomly selected people are trusted and can talk about sensibly every different policy area across the whole spectrum, why don't we actually give them the political power and eliminate elections and politicians as we now know them?
Hence the name of the book, The End of Politicians. Fantastic. Yeah. What results have come from these experiments?
In Ireland, they're the poster child of Sortition at the moment. They had a citizens' assembly with 2/3 randomly selected people and 1/3 politicians, and they talked about such things as same-sex marriage, and the same-sex marriage referendum was a direct outcome of that Irish deliberation. The next time when they came back to do another Sortition event, they said, actually, we don't need the politicians, and they just randomly selected 99 everyday people from all over Ireland, put them in a room. They've been talking for about 17 months now. One of the main topics was the constitutional ban on abortion, and has led to the government now announcing a referendum in May, which is predicted to win. How much of that win is due to the effects of the Assembly is of course debatable, but there's been a significant shift, and I think it's because people trust these citizens' assemblies. They trust what they suggest, and they're proposing a radical liberalisation of the abortion regime in Ireland.
This trust is fascinating. So I, through links by you, I ended up listening to Ed Miliband doing a talk about sortition, or learning about sortition, and speaking to some experts. Can you describe to us this research that there was one woman talking about research.
Sarah Allen involved.
Right, so basically, if I understand correctly, there is now ironclad proof that the people trust the people way more than they trust the politicians. Tell us a little bit about that.
Ironclad is very strong, but there are various studies that show that people trust these citizens' assemblies. One of the classic ones was in British Columbia, where that province of Canada wanted to go about doing some electoral reform. And they said, how should we do this? Well, let's create a citizens' assembly, which will meet for a year, and then we'll put their recommendation, which was a virtual consensus to replace first past the post by alternate vote or something. Yeah. Let's put this to a referendum later, and the academics swarmed around and did their research, and they found that if people knew about the Citizens' Assembly and knew it was their proposal, they were far more likely to vote for that proposal. Of course, there was this issue of actually getting the word out and making sure that people knew about that assembly. In Belgium, there's been research into if people would trust an assembly of elected representatives more or less than an assembly of randomly selected people. And it comes out about a third, a third, a third. A third would trust the politicians, a third would trust the randomly selected, and a third have no idea. They just say, well, I don't know. But this, even 5 years ago, is remarkable to me, I think. It shows that actually this idea that you could randomly select people and give them legislative power is now on the up. Like 5 years ago, I imagined people would be like, what? Giving these people power. So yeah, there's more and more research going on that's showing that everyday people trust what these people say, right? Which makes sense, of course. They're not being lobbied. They're not involved in this political horse trading to get their thing through. They're not constrained by the members of their party, by media necessity, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. When you look at the kinds of problems that the species is facing, the really, really big problems, climate change, migration or refugee situation, because being exacerbated by wars for the last resources, etc. Is there a place for the sortition process to begin to address such heavyweight questions?
So in Ireland, at the Citizens' Assembly, they had 5 topics, I think, on their agenda, one of which was how to make Ireland a leader in climate change. And so they discussed climate change, and they said, actually, okay, we need to do something about the meat industry in Ireland, the agricultural system, which is causing lots of the pollution, and of course the Farmers Union is up in arms about all this kind of stuff. They had a Europolis event, and I think it was 2009. It was a deliberative poll where they got 350 Europeans from every country together with simultaneous translation. They talked about climate change, migration, all these kinds of topics. It was just before the EU election, and one of the key results was it led to a major shift of support for the Green Party at the EU level, because they were the only ones that seemed to actually be trying to address these issues. It was much less clear on migration. The change in opinion on migration wasn't so substantial. Sure. But you can address any topic more or less. I mean, process is really important. So you need a good, deliberative, informed process, and there's all key aspects of that that are very important to pay attention to get right. But yeah, you can address any complex issue, and these people are capable, and they are more than the sum of their parts.
Great. Can you, just for the sake of the viewers, can you just go through the steps of a process? Because people probably aren't totally clear what deliberative democracy means.
Yes.
So just the basic steps that you'd have to go through of the process itself. Yeah.
So typically, because they can't make it mandatory at the moment, of course, it's not like it. In theory, it's like jury service. But in practice, there's a voluntary aspect to it. So in Australia, for example, the New Democracy Foundation, which has done maybe 30 of these processes, they send out 5,000 or 10,000 randomly selected letters to randomly selected addresses. People get this invitation saying, would you be interested in talking about this subject at this time on this weekend? A certain number of people respond, maybe 5-10%. Of those people, they then do a stratified random sample, so it's a second random sampling, to make sure, because typically they get an over-respondence, is that a word? People over-reply if you're older, more educated, etc. So then they do a stratified sample where they make sure that they match the census data, to make sure that this microcosm of society is a perfect mirror of the country that you're in. So you get Australia in a room, or you get the UK in a room. So that's the second step. The third step is then you have a stakeholder group or an expert panel that tries to come up with some balanced information, and these people can also come into the room to address the people that are there, to correct biases, and just to give the people, the everyday people that are there, a broad spectrum of opinion of what you might want to do in this policy domain. And of course, that's also a key part, and how you do that is very important. Then they do this deliberative process, which can go for 2 days, 6 days. It can go for 1 weekend every month for 17 months in Ireland. And there's a whole process typically around small table facilitated discussion, where people talk about these topics, and they talk with each other, and they get exposed to diverse viewpoints, and they have to try to justify what their viewpoint is. That's the key of deliberation. It's not just saying, oh, we don't want that. It's, I don't want that because, and this process of actually trying to think why you don't want that it makes people change their mind. Yeah. At the end of this process, they typically produce a report, or they have some straw polls on which of the various policy options they like the most. So for example, in the Irish case, there was a whole series of questions of, should we allow abortion on demand at any time? Should we allow it up to 12 weeks? Should we allow it only in cases of fetal abnormality? And they do this voting system on that, and you find that 2/3, 3/4 want to allow it up to 12 weeks on demand, no questions asked, and things like this. What happens to that report at the end is also interesting, because of course, if the government is not constrained by that, they could just say thank you very much and throw it away.
Sure.
So the New Democracy Foundation makes sure that the government promises to at least table this report in the relevant assembly, parliament. There's been some citizens' assemblies in Gdansk in Poland, where the local city council has said, if 80% of the people say yes, we'll be bound by their decision. So that's like a first step to actually making that connection. In Ireland, it's actually got a mixed, if you look at the precise details, there's actually a mixed record of the government responding to these things. Sometimes they pick it up and run with it, and sometimes they don't. In the abortion case, in the constitutional ban on abortion, this Citizens' Assembly has just opened up the political space so widely that the politicians are gladly stepping into it and saying, yes, okay, let's reform. Whereas before they were fearing to tread.
Sure, because of their democratic position is not being threatened because they're saying, well, I haven't said this, the people
Exactly,
have said this.
exactly.
So it's a get-out clause in a way for some politicians.
Yes, it's great for these hot potato issues for politicians. They don't have to do anything publicly controversial until they see which way the will of the people moves, and then they can say, oh, we're just following the informed will of the people, not just a knee-jerk opinion poll, but the informed post-deliberative will.
One of the terrifying bits about listening to Ed Miliband's radio podcast was he didn't know anything about sortition at the start, and then he learned about it very quickly. Some great people were on there speaking about it, and he instantly was going, why aren't we doing this? And what would have happened to Brexit? What do you think would have happened to Brexit if we'd had this situation in place, a sortition process?
So a group of people in the UK did a post-Brexit assembly where they talked about the conditions of Brexit. What sort of Brexit? Hard Brexit, soft Brexit. It was the Electoral Reform Society, some academics from University of Westminster involved, again, Sarah Ellen for involved. They got people in the room and they said, would you like a hard Brexit or soft Brexit? These people talked for a couple of weekends and they said, okay, we'd like this. But to me, one of the most interesting things was one of the organisers came out saying, so many people have said, why didn't we do this beforehand? And what comes out is that actually, it's impossible to predict, but I would guess that you wouldn't be where you are, perhaps.
Pretty likely. Okay, what would you like to see happen? Because it's a very engaging title, The End of Politicians, right? I'm an occupier, as you know, and I'm well behind that. But what would you like to see happen for this to escalate in a way where it actually can have impact on world politics?
Yeah, I think at the moment what we're seeing is quite an explosion of ad hoc, one-off assemblies, policy juries all over the world. Canada, Australia, also US, also in South America. There's a group doing this in schools, and in Brazil people have done farmers' juries on GM crops, etc. So it's happening all over the world. The next step is to actually institutionalize that, I think. The logical position to me to start with would be a House of Review. So, for example, getting rid of the House of Lords and making that a House of the People, a citizen Senate, if you like. And that, to me, once you actually had... This would not threaten the politicians too much, and could even show them as being innovators, and it would sort of appease the populist critique of control by elite by putting everyday people in positions of power. And then my second step, my dream, would be that after we have these two houses, everyone looks at the house full of politicians and the house full of everyday people and says, well, they make reasonable, good decisions, and those people are busy backstabbing and infighting. Why do we need that house? And we would actually abolish elections and just have a sortition house legislating.
Sounds like a beautiful future. Let's go for it. Brett Hennig, thank you so much indeed.
No problem. Thank you. Thanks, Jeremy.